Story 1. The cornmeal morning a day in a 17th century tavern kitchen. The morning begins before light. You can almost hear it, the scrape of iron against ash, the hollow cough of a new flame waking inside the hearth. Somewhere in a small colonial tavern, perhaps in Massachusetts, perhaps in Maryland, a woman named Anne or Martha, or someone whose name is now lost entirely, stirs from her straw bed. Her feet touch the packed dirt floor. She moves quietly, for there is no room for ceremony at this hour. The tavern must be warm before the travelers wake. Outside, the air holds the pale cold of early spring, the kind that bites without wind. The sun is not yet visible, but the world has begun its faint gray turning toward morning. Inside the kitchen, a single iron pot waits beside the ashes of last night's fire. Cornmeal sits in a wooden bowl beside it, coarse, yellow, a little musty from storage in a barrel. It will become mush, or what they called hasty pudding, the simplest breakfast of all. Cornmeal was the grain of necessity. Imported wheat flour was dear, too expensive for daily use, and unreliable in supply. Ships from England might bring sacks of it, but between storms, embargoes, and spoilage, the colonists learned to rely instead on maize, the grain of the New World. The native peoples had taught them its ways, how to dry it, grind it, and boil it into something that would sustain body and spirit alike. It was plain food, humble and unadorned, yet it became the backbone of the colonial morning. Anne adds a handful of salt to the boiling water, the steam curling around her face. She stirs slowly, clockwise, with a long-handled spoon. The sound of the spoon scraping against iron is steady, rhythmic. This is the heartbeat of the colonial kitchen: repetition, patience, and the quiet knowledge that small labors kept a family or a business alive. Soon the smell of cooked corn rises into the rafters. A tavern was more than a place for travelers. It was the pulse of a settlement. Before roads were good or inns plentiful, these taverns fed the post riders, merchants, and weary farmers who carried the colonies, gossip and goods from one town to the next. Breakfast here might be simple, but it was shared, eaten beside strangers at long tables, washed down with small beer or cider instead of coffee, since coffee was rare and expensive. The warmth of the food and the company alike made up for its plainness. Small beer, weak, lightly fermented, was safer than water which might be drawn from a brackish well or tainted stream. It carried just enough alcohol to purify, not enough to intoxicate. In a corner of the room, a boy of about 12 taps the keg, filling wooden mugs. His hands are red from the cold. He works silently. There is no time for chatter before dawn. Behind him, another servant sweeps the floor, brushing away last night's dirt and ashes. Cornmeal mush thickens as it cooks. Anne lifts the spoon and watches the slow, reluctant bubbles rise and pop. If there is milk, a rare luxury this early in spring, she will stir some in, or add a bit of butter from the crock. Most mornings there is none, and the mush must do as it is. When travelers come, she might fry it into cakes on the griddle, served with molasses if supplies allow. Molasses was cheaper than sugar, a product of the triangular trade shipped from the Caribbean plantations, where enslaved laborers boiled cane day and night. Every spoonful carried a cost invisible to those who ate it. As the sun finally pushes its first light through the window, the tavern comes alive. Hooves in the yard, voices outside, low and muffled. The smell of the hearth mingles with the damp wool of travelers' cloaks hung by the fire to dry. Wooden spoons clatter into bowls. The boy pours cider. Someone coughs. Another mutters about the road to Boston. The sound of the spoon in the pot slows, then stops. Anne ladles out the mush, each portion nearly identical, neither generous nor stingy. Fairness is an unspoken law in a place like this. It is easy, from a modern distance, to overlook the small weight of this meal. But in the 1600s, food was survival, and breakfast was not a leisure. It was the first duty of the day. Taverns like this one marked the rhythm of colonial life, where information, warmth, and sustenance met in the same room. In an age without printed newspapers or daily mail, a traveler's story told over a bowl of cornmeal might be the only news a village would hear for weeks. You imagine sitting there, the wooden bench hard beneath you, the air thick with the smell of damp ash and warm grain. The mush is bland but filling. You listen to the talk of the table, of distant ships, of taxes, of rumors of war. None of it feels real yet, and none of it touches the steady rhythm of the morning spoon in the pot. By the time the last bowls are emptied and the fire burns bright again, the world outside has changed. The gray light has turned gold. Travelers mount their horses. The boy scrubs the bowls in cold water. The tavern will sleep again until the next guest knocks at the door. And somewhere in that quiet, the question lingers. How many mornings like this passed, unnoticed, before history began to write itself? It is now mid-morning. The sun rides higher, though not yet warm, and shadows stretch long across the packed dirt road outside the tavern. Inside, the breakfast bowls have been cleared, the small beer finished, and the room is quieter but not still. Work has only shifted, not slowed. Anne is at the griddle now. This is not the flat steel you may imagine, but a heavy iron plate suspended above the hearth, blackened from years of smoke and fire. It is seasoned not with oil but with labor. Decades of use have made it slick, pitted, and serviceable. The cornmeal mush from earlier has cooled in a wooden basin, stiffening as it sat. Now she slices it into rough cakes and places them on the hot metal, listening for the faint hiss that tells her the iron is ready. No timers, no thermometers, only experience, the kind passed down without books. These cakes are called journey cakes by some, Johnny cakes by others, a term whose precise origin is lost to time. Some say it came from the Narragansett word Johnakin, others from journey cake, because they traveled well in saddle bags. Crisp at the edges and soft inside, they were durable, filling, and plain. They could be eaten cold or warm, with molasses if lucky, or with drippings saved from yesterday's pork. Anne does not measure. She moves with the muscle memory of years, pressing the cakes down, flipping them with the edge of a wooden spatula. She is not alone. Another woman, perhaps her sister or a hired girl, tends to the coals. She shuffles them with a long-handled iron, watching for hot spots. The fire must be managed constantly. There are no knobs to turn, no matches to strike. Ash is swept aside and reused, mixed with lye to make soap, or scattered outside near the garden. Nothing is wasted, not even waste. Behind them, on a rough-hewn table near the window, sits a large pewter basin filled with dried apples. These were sliced thin months ago, laid on racks and slowly dried in the late summer sun. Now rehydrated with warm water and gently stewed, they make a sweet, or at least sweetish, side for the cakes. Not everyone in the tavern will get some. Only those with coins to spare. In the colonies, apples were among the first and most important fruits to be cultivated. Grafted and grown from European rootstock, they flourished in the temperate soil of New England and the mid-Atlantic. By the mid-1600s, nearly every farmstead had a few trees. Not all were for eating, many were destined for cider, the safe and ubiquitous drink of the colonies. Even children drank it, often watered down. It was easier to grow apples than wheat, and easier to drink cider than trust a well. Anne checks the cakes again, stacking the browned ones on a wooden plate, setting fresh ones to cook. The rhythm is unhurried but not idle. Everything in this kitchen follows a logic born of scarcity: make do, reuse, repurpose. The cloth on the table was once a curtain. The curtain was once a dress. There is no waste in a colonial tavern kitchen because there is no room for indulgence. Outside the window, you might see chickens scratching near the root cellar door, where pickled vegetables sit in wooden barrels beneath the earth. The rooster has stopped crowing. A pair of boots crunch across the gravel path, another traveler perhaps, or a neighbor bringing news. You never know what may arrive at a tavern. A soldier with a dispatch, a minister on horseback, a farmer with a wagon full of eggs. Every knock at the door carries the breath of distant places. A traveler enters, his coat dusted from the road, hat pressed tight against the morning sun. He is hungry but does not ask for more than can be offered. A few cakes, a mug of cider, perhaps some stewed apples if they remain. Anne nods without speaking and sets to it. Her movements are practiced, efficient. She does not look tired, though she has been on her feet since long before light. The traveler eats quickly but not carelessly. Food like this is rare on the road, hot, fresh, and honest. He listens to the sounds around him. A dog barking outside, the low voice of the tavern keeper speaking to someone near the stable, the crackle of the fire behind him. It is not quiet, but it is peaceful, the kind of peace that emerges when people are too busy to worry and too tired to complain. Not far from the hearth hangs a string of dried herbs, sage, thyme, and something bitter and unfamiliar. These are used not only in cooking but for medicine. Colonial kitchens were apothecaries too, with remedies passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. A bit of willow bark for pain, or a mustard poultice for cough. The women of the tavern are cooks, yes, but also healers, stewards, and silent recorders of daily life. A ledger sits on a shelf, its cover stained and corners bent. In it are the names of guests, the dates of stays, the payments made or promised. Often written in a careful, slanted hand, these entries offer no detail beyond the essential. No emotions, no context, just names and numbers, a ghostly record of those who passed through and those who never returned. Some were soldiers, some were debtors, a few were preachers or peddlers. All were part of the slow, creeping sprawl of the colonies. By midday, the tavern kitchen begins to shift once more. The breakfast fire is banked, the ashes pushed aside to make room for the next meal. Porridge gives way to stew, cakes give way to bread. A new pot is brought to the hearth, filled with beans soaked overnight. Salt pork is chopped, onions added. The air thickens again, not with urgency, but with continuity. Meals flow into one another, not as events, but as ongoing states of being. A tavern never truly stops cooking. Anne wipes her hands on a linen apron smudged from the morning. Her back aches, though she does not say so. There is no reward for complaint and no rest for those who keep others fed. Her labor, unseen, unnamed in most historical records, is the foundation upon which every conversation, every political rumor, every merchant's deal in that tavern will rest. Without food, there is no commerce. Without women like Anne, there is no tavern. And so she stokes the fire again. The coals glow red. The pot begins to steam. Outside, a bell rings, perhaps to call the midday guests, or perhaps simply to remind the town that time is still moving. But what happens when history doesn't record the name of the hand that stirred the pot? What do we lose when we forget who fed the revolution? The day deepens. Outside the tavern, the hum of life continues. Wagons creak along uneven roads, horses stamp in the muddy yard, voices rise and fall like waves. But within the kitchen, time slows again. The afternoon fire burns lower now, less vigorous than morning's flame. The cook's work is not done, it simply becomes quieter. Still, the kitchen holds a pulse, like a low drum beat under everything else. Anne sits briefly on a stool beside the hearth, rubbing her wrists. The rhythm of stirring cornmeal, lifting iron pots, and kneading dough wears on the body, especially as years pass. She is not old, most women in the colonies could not afford to be, but her hands tell of labor beyond her age. Around her, the tavern breathes. Footsteps above on wooden floors, the soft clink of glass, muffled conversation behind a thick timber door. She reaches for a bowl and begins preparing samp, a dish even simpler than mush. Made from coarsely ground corn, closer to cracked kernels than fine meal, it is boiled slowly with water, sometimes with beans. The Wampanoag and other indigenous peoples had prepared this food long before colonists arrived. In some taverns, it was adapted as cheap fare for midday or evening meals, especially in rural areas where provisions ran thin. Corn became the common denominator, the element that bound one's stomach to the next, from soldier to servant, from guest to host. It is easy to imagine, if you listen carefully, how this food traveled further than it seemed. The men in the tavern's common room speak in low tones, not just of crops or cattle, but of taxes, of parliament, of paper proclamations nailed to church doors. There is unease in their voices. One of them, a merchant recently returned from Boston, talks of unrest, of taverns where British officers now sit unwelcomed, of ships turned away, of goods rotting on the docks. Another grumbles about molasses being harder to come by since the Sugar Act. They speak cautiously, but the words linger in the air like smoke. What they don't realize, perhaps, is that the food they eat is already part of the protest. When molasses prices rose, colonial cooks began substituting. They boiled down apples or squash, used wild honey, or served corn cakes plain. When imported tea was taxed, they brewed dried raspberry leaves instead. When British flour became scarce or expensive, they relied more on native grains: corn, oats, buckwheat. The revolution began not only in pamphlets and battles, but in kitchens, in bowls and pots, in quiet refusals to consume what came with a tax. The tavern kitchen, in its own way, was a place of subtle rebellion. Anne knows this, though she doesn't speak of it. She stirs the samp slowly, methodically. Later that evening, she will pour it into bowls, top it with a small pat of fat if there's any left. The guests will eat and speak of liberty or law or loyalty to the crown, never realizing that the very thing they consume, this unadorned, indigenous grain, carries a history longer and deeper than their own arrival. Outside, the wind rises. A storm might be coming. You can hear it in the creak of the tavern's wooden frame, in the way the shutters rattle gently. Anne moves to cover the coals, adding a thick log and banking ash around it to keep the heat. The kitchen must remain warm through the night. There may be late guests, or an injured rider, or a poor widow seeking shelter with a child in tow. The hearth is never truly cold, only quiet. It is here, in this twilight, not just of the day, but of an era, that the significance of breakfast reemerges. Think of how many mornings passed like this. How many bowls of cornmeal were stirred, how many cakes flipped, how many apples stewed in the same pots, on the same fires, by hands whose names are no longer spoken. These were not ceremonial meals. They were meals of function, survival, repetition. But they held a nation together long before the word nation was spoken aloud. The Continental Army, when it finally marched, was fed largely on the same foods: corn mush, salted pork, dried beans, coarse bread. George Washington himself once wrote of the shortage of flour and the reliance on cornmeal to feed troops. Soldiers wrote letters home asking for dried apples or molasses, not luxuries, but reminders of home. The tavern kitchens of colonial America became the blueprint for army encampments, where women followed troops as cooks and laundresses, boiling mush over open flames just as they had in more peaceful times. And so the kitchen, the one you've now sat in across these hours, became more than a room. It was a fulcrum, a quiet engine of survival. It absorbed the politics, the scarcity, the resistance, and turned them into nourishment, not with glory but with steady, necessary labor. Anne does not know her name will not be written in any histories, that her samp will not be recorded in the annals of revolution, that no one will ask what she used when molasses ran out, or where she got the corn that saved her family through a harsh winter. She does not expect this. Her duty is not to legacy, but to fire, food, and the breath of those she feeds. Still, in the warm stillness of that kitchen, you wonder, how many nations are built on the backs of forgotten breakfasts? Story 2. Maple sugar and the silence of winter breakfasts of New England farmers. The forest is still. So still, in fact, that you can hear the weight of snow as it shifts slightly on a high branch and falls soundless to the ground below. It is late winter in colonial New England, and though the ground is frozen and the days short, something ancient and quiet is beginning. The slow, unseen process that turns trees into sugar. The sugar maple, Acer saccharum, is just beginning to wake. Its roots, deep beneath the frost, sense the change. Its sap will begin to rise soon, drawn upward by cold nights and warming days. And with that first thaw, the farmers and their families stir too, not to plant, not yet, but to collect, to boil, to prepare for the long tail of winter, and to fill their mornings with the only sweetness available in this season. There is no breakfast as deeply tied to winter as the one made with maple sugar. A man in thick woolen stockings and a worn leather apron carries a hand auger into the woods. He is not alone. A boy follows behind, steadying a wooden bucket that smells faintly of ash and wood smoke. The man, perhaps his name is Elias, or Josiah, picks a likely tree, drills with the slow precision that only years of practice grant, and inserts a small wooden spile. Sap, clear as water, begins to drip almost immediately. Each tree yields slowly, drop by drop. A single sugar maple might offer 10 gallons of sap over the season, enough, after hours of boiling, to yield about 1 quart of sugar or syrup. The ratio is brutal: 40 gallons of sap for 1 gallon of syrup. But the result is precious, a source of sweetness that did not rely on expensive cane sugar from distant plantations. The family will boil the sap in the sugar house, a small outbuilding that smells always of wood smoke and steam. Inside, an iron kettle hangs above a roaring fire. It takes hours to boil, days even. The man tends the fire. His wife skims the top of the bubbling sap. The children bring more buckets. They do not waste time speaking. There is only work, steam, and the slow, sticky alchemy of sap into sugar. And in the main house, breakfast is waiting. It is not a grand meal. Most likely it consists of flummery porridge made from oats or cornmeal boiled in milk or water until thick and slightly gelatinous. Some flummery is served warm. Some is left to cool and set. The version in this household is humble, plain, until a spoonful of freshly made maple sugar is stirred in. The sugar doesn't dissolve completely. It melts into small amber streaks. A spoonful brings a moment of sweetness, sharp and earthy with notes of wood and smoke. It is not like modern syrup, thin, over-refined. This is rough, grainy sugar, boiled to a solid and chipped from a cone, or perhaps stored in wooden molds shaped like hearts or stars. These shapes aren't decorative. They're practical, easier to store, easier to trade. The children sit on low stools beside the hearth, bowls in hand, eating quietly. Outside, the wind whistles faintly and the trees drip into waiting buckets. There is no sense of urgency here, only repetition. In a world where food cannot be wasted and ingredients are gathered by hand from the land, meals are not indulgences. They are survival, tinged with ceremony. In wealthier colonial towns, the elite might enjoy imported sugar from the West Indies. But in rural New England, maple sugar was a point of pride, a domestic sweetener. Even abolitionists in later years would promote its use over cane sugar, which was intimately tied to enslaved labor. But in the 17th and early 18th centuries, it was simply a necessity. The forest offered it freely in exchange only for firewood, time, and labor. The sap continues to boil. The steam clings to the low beams of the sugar house. Hours pass. Later, the family will pour some of the syrup onto the snow to make a sticky taffy for the children, a brief delight in the harsh months before spring. But that is not the focus now. Breakfast comes first, then chores, then the slow, aching work of farming in a land that offers no ease. The farmer's wife, who rose well before the sun, stirs a pot over the hearth. This one contains hulled corn soaked overnight in water and wood ash, a process known to the native peoples and later called nixtamalization. This method softens the corn and makes it more digestible, breaking down its outer hull. It is slow work, smelly and messy, but essential. She boils the corn slowly with beans, forming a dish known as succotash, which may serve as a secondary breakfast or a midday meal. Maple sugar might be added here, too, just a touch. The fire crackles, and in the corner of the room hangs a row of dried apples, strung up on twine. These too may be rehydrated and cooked in the coals, perhaps with a dab of sugar added. Every part of this breakfast is tied to memory, to earlier seasons, to past labors, to the land's cyclical offerings. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything is prepared. You can feel the stillness of the room, hear the ticking of a wooden wall clock, smell the faint sweetness of the boiling sap outside. In many ways, this breakfast is the opposite of the bustling colonial tavern we visited before. Here, there are no guests, no traveling merchants, no gossip from distant ports. Here, the world is small, self-contained, and inward. It is a place where time is measured not by clocks but by seasons, by sap flow, by snowfall. And yet, even in the stillness, history hums in the background. Because these rural families, quiet though they were, built the foundation of resistance. They were self-sufficient, skeptical of distant control, and increasingly irritated by the taxes levied on things they rarely used. Why pay for imported sugar when the maple trees gave freely? Why buy tea when herbs from the meadow steeped just as well? These breakfasts, sweetened by native trees, stirred by hand, eaten beside the fire, became acts of quiet independence. But how long could such independence last, in a world growing ever more entangled? The cold remains. Even as the sap begins to run, even as the sun lingers a few minutes longer each day, winter still has its hold on the New England countryside. The snow outside the farmhouse lies crusted, heavy with the residue of older storms. Icicles cling to the eaves like frozen teeth. But inside the wooden house, the hearth remains alive, a world of red glow and silent energy. In homes like these, the kitchen was not a separate room. It was the room. It contained the fire, the meals, the warmth, and in many cases the family's entire sense of survival. Every item had a place. Wooden spoons darkened by decades of stirring, iron kettles suspended on hooks in the chimney's throat, butter paddles, salt boxes, a mortar and pestle worn nearly smooth. The colonial kitchen was not decorative. It was utilitarian, but sacred in its own way, especially during the long weeks of winter, when the world outside offered little mercy. Today, the breakfast is Pompeian pudding, a dish made from dried pumpkin, cornmeal, and a bit of maple sugar or syrup. The pumpkin, stored from the harvest, has been sliced, dried, and rehydrated by the fire overnight. Cornmeal, ground last fall at the nearby gristmill, forms the base. The mixture is stirred together, poured into a cast-iron pan, and baked in the coals, not over flame, but beside it in a bed of ash that provides even, dry heat. The process is patient, slow, and slightly smoky. But in an hour or two, it yields a golden, slightly crusted pudding, lightly sweet, hearty, and perfectly suited to a cold morning. A child waits with a wooden bowl, cradling it like a fragile gift. The first spoonful steams in the air. The taste is rich, not sugary, but warm. It is the kind of food that fills the stomach and anchors the day. The use of pumpkin in colonial cooking was widespread, especially in the northern colonies. European settlers had learned to cultivate the Pompeian from indigenous peoples, who valued it not only for its yield but for its storability. It could be dried and kept all winter, and with the addition of maple sugar, it became one of the few treats that could be made without reliance on foreign trade. Trade was, of course, both a promise and a threat. Even in these isolated households, the world of commerce touched everything. Salt was imported from the Caribbean. Iron was shipped from England. Window glass, if one could afford it, was a sign of wealth precisely because it came across an ocean. But food could still be mostly local. In New England especially, where the soil was poor and the winters long, families prided themselves on producing or bartering for almost all their needs. Maple sugar fit perfectly into that philosophy. It was domestic, renewable, culturally distinct. And unlike cane sugar, it came without guilt, no ships full of enslaved people, no lash of the overseer baked into its cost. Though these moral arguments would not fully rise to the surface until the mid-18th century, even early colonists understood the value of self-reliance. They celebrated it with every wooden bowl filled by their own hands. In the evening, after the chores are done, the family may sit around the fire and drink a small mug of warm milk mixed with maple sugar and nutmeg. It is a luxury. To be sure, milk is scarce in winter and spices rarer still. But these little indulgences matter. They create memory. They soften hardship. The taste of sugar in winter becomes, over time, a marker of family, of survival, of identity. The children, sleepy, full, and warm, ask their mother about the first time she made sugar. She smiles, smoothing her apron across her lap, and begins to tell the story. She was perhaps 10, perhaps younger. Her own mother had shown her how to tap the tree with a hand-forged spile, how to hang the bucket at just the right angle. They had carried the sap together to the sugar house, where the steam rose so thick it seemed like fog. She remembered the roar of the fire, the sweetness of the air, the way her hair smelled of wood smoke for days afterward. She also remembers the frostbitten fingers, the soot in her eyes, the pain of standing too long in wet shoes. But these are not parts of the story she tells tonight. These are things children will learn on their own in time. There is a silence in the room as the story ends, not an awkward one, but a silence born of satisfaction. The fire settles with a long exhale. The wooden beams above creak gently as the wind presses against the house. Outside, in the dark, the maple trees stand tall and bare, each one with a small wooden spile jutting from its trunk like a secret message. Tomorrow, the sap will run again. In Boston, debates rage about loyalty to the crown. In New York, newspapers argue over taxes. In Philadelphia, men draft declarations. But here, in the quiet of a farmhouse, the only argument is over whether to serve mush or pudding in the morning. And yet this house, this kitchen, this sugar will shape the future in ways no one yet understands. Because maple sugar becomes more than a sweetener, it becomes a symbol of the land's gifts, of the rejection of imported goods, of survival without empire. But how long can a small house in the woods remain untouched by the world's noise? The fire has dimmed, not out, never out, but lower now, banked with ash and glowing in the half-light of morning. The farmhouse has not yet stirred. No footsteps on the stairs, no clink of ladles, no buckets being carried through the snow. But the maple trees are awake. They drip with patient rhythm into their wooden buckets. Tap, tap, tap. The sap runs clear, thinner than water, silent as breath. In this final stretch of winter, the tail end of February, the beginning of March, the sugaring season hits its quiet peak. The days are longer, though still cold. The ground remains frozen, but the light has changed. It is wider now, angled. And the farmers know that time is short. The trees will stop flowing soon. Sap runs only in this brief window, this sliver of seasonal generosity, when winter loosens its grip but spring hasn't yet taken hold. Inside the house, the mother rises first. She pulls on her wool shawl and steps into the cold kitchen. There is no warmth, yet the fire must be coaxed back to life. She stirs the embers, adds dry kindling, blows carefully. Soon the orange glow returns. She places a blackened kettle on the hook above the flames. Inside, cracked oats and dried berries, soaked overnight. Today's breakfast is oat porridge with maple sugar and wild blueberries, the berries picked last summer and preserved in honey or vinegar, their flavor a welcome shock in the monotony of winter. She stirs the porridge slowly. The rhythm is the same as her mother's and her grandmother's before that. Around her, the kitchen remains unchanged. Shelves of crockery, bundles of dried herbs, strings of garlic, the same smells, the same silence. In the back room, the children begin to stir. By now, sugar cakes have begun to pile in the storeroom. These are not soft cakes, but hard, crystalline blocks of maple sugar poured into carved wooden molds and dried by the hearth. Some are shaped like small animals or stars. Others are simple bricks. They will be grated or shaved into meals for months to come, a small local treasury that requires no coin, no trade, no foreign dependency. And they are valuable far more than one might assume. In rural economies, maple sugar could be bartered like money. A molded cake might be traded for wool, soap, a wooden tool, or even an hour of a neighbor's labor. In times when coin was scarce and trust was personal, sugar became both a comfort and a currency. As the family gathers around the hearth for breakfast, the mood is quiet, even reverent. The porridge is served hot, each bowl topped with a flake of sugar and a spoonful of the preserved berries. Steam curls from each bowl. No one speaks for a while, not because speech is forbidden, but because it isn't needed. The food speaks. It says we are still here. It says the land still provides. It says sweetness need not come from far away, nor at great cost. Later, the father will walk to the sugar house with the eldest son. They will boil more sap. They will watch the steam rise and collect on the rafters in great dripping beads. They will skim and stir and tend the fire for hours. The boy will grow tired. The man will say little. But as the sun arcs overhead, the sap will darken. The smell will change from watery wood to sweet molasses. They will know by scent and color when it is done. Back in the house, the mother will begin baking maple johnny cakes. She stirs cornmeal with hot water, adds a spoonful of lard, and folds in flakes of hardened sugar. The batter is thick, almost stiff, and she presses it onto the hot griddle stone. The cakes hiss, releasing steam and the unmistakable scent of maple. Not strong, not overpowering, but earthy, grounded. A scent that feels older than memory. She wraps the cakes in cloth, places them in a basket. These will be taken to town to trade, to share, perhaps to sell at market. They may end up on another family's table or in a soldier's pack or as a gift to a neighbor recovering from illness. No label, no brand, just sustenance and care. What's striking, if you pause to notice it, is how little this life asks of the outside world. The farmhouse does not rely on imports. The meals are made from what was grown, gathered, stored. The sugar comes from the trees out back, not the canes of the West Indies. The bread is made from local corn, not British wheat. Even the herbs mint, sage, lavender are grown in the garden plot now hidden beneath the snow. In a way, it is a quiet act of defiance. Not loud like protest, not fast like revolution, but defiance all the same. Later in the century, these values will crystallize. The colonial boycotts of British goods, especially after the Stamp Act and Tea Act, will turn household consumption into a political act. Choosing not to buy becomes as loud as choosing to fight. And women, the keepers of the kitchen, the ones who stirred the pots and baked the cakes, will find themselves at the center of it all. The daughters of liberty will gather to spin their own cloth, sweeten their foods with maple instead of sugar, and drink herbal infusions in place of tax tea. And while this particular farmhouse, tucked away in the snow-covered hills, may never appear in any ledger of resistance, its choices resonate. Because the people here have lived that independence long before it became a slogan. As evening returns, the final chores of the day are finished. The buckets are emptied. The sap is boiling once again. The children play with wooden toys near the fire. The house smells of smoke and sweetness, of ash and grain. And the woman at the hearth grates the last of the hardened sugar onto the hot cakes, watching it melt into the ridges like sunlight into snow. It is easy, from the distance of centuries, to see these meals as quaint. But there is nothing quaint about survival. There is nothing soft about farming in the snow, boiling sap for hours, or cooking with ingredients that must last an entire season. There is power here, slow, deliberate power in choosing to feed oneself from the land, in resisting reliance, in stirring sweetness from a tree rather than a plantation. And so the story ends, not with drama, but with a warm plate of corn cakes passed from hand to hand. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary thing a person can do is refuse to buy what they can make. Anchor Story 3. The ship's biscuit breakfasts at sea during the Atlantic crossings. The sea is endless, gray, cold, and patient. For those crossing the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries, breakfast came with the sound of gulls and the creak of ropes, with sails snapping overhead and the deep groan of a wooden hull pushing through indifferent waters. Days at sea blended together into one long motion. Sunrises and sunsets marked time, but barely. There were no clocks aboard, just bells. 8 bells in a watch. 4 hours to a shift. Rations issued once a day. Nothing changed except the weather. And breakfast, it was rarely warm, rarely fresh, often disappointing, always essential. In this world, the centerpiece of the morning meal, if it could be called that, was the ship's biscuit. Also known as hardtack, the ship's biscuit was a round or square slab of unleavened, twice-baked bread made only of flour and water. No yeast, no fat, no salt. It was baked until rock hard, then dried even further in warm ovens. Properly stored, a biscuit could last years. Improperly stored, it would be overtaken by weevils. but spoiled or not, it would still be eaten. The biscuit did not pretend to be pleasant. It could chip teeth. Some men soaked it in beer or water to soften it, or pounded it with the butt of a knife into crumbs for porridge. Others simply gnawed, jaw aching, chewing long past the point of flavor. In truth, there was almost no flavor to begin with, a neutral, dusty blandness broken only by occasional bitterness, especially if insects had laid eggs inside. Still, it was the backbone of shipboard survival. Aboard merchant ships, passenger vessels, and even slavers and Navy frigates, the biscuit formed the base of morning rations. Depending on the ship, it might be accompanied by salt beef or pork heavily cured to withstand the journey. Or it might be paired with peas pudding, a thick, mashed paste of dried yellow peas boiled in a cloth bag, often eaten cold the next day. On some ships, particularly Dutch or British ones bound for the American colonies, breakfast would include burgoo, a thin porridge made from oatmeal and water, cooked slowly in large copper kettles. Seamen were fond of it, especially when flavored with a bit of molasses or grease skimmed from the previous day's stew. But more often than not, burgoo was thin, lumpy, and short on any spice. Still, it warmed the belly, a small mercy on cold Atlantic mornings. Most meals were eaten on deck, unless the weather made it impossible. Below decks, where the sleeping quarters were, it was too dark and too damp to comfortably eat. The smell of unwashed men, salt, and bilge water overwhelmed the senses. And so, wrapped in heavy coats, men sat cross-legged on deck with a tin bowl and a mug of small beer or water, watching the endless churn of the sea as they chewed their ration. You can almost see it, a row of sailors or settlers hunched over on a rolling deck, each holding a biscuit softened in ale or soup, steam rising from tin bowls. The air is cold. Salt crusts their collars. Someone coughs. Another mutters about the weather, always the weather, and always there is wind. For passengers, especially those emigrating to the colonies, breakfast was both routine and relief. It offered distraction from seasickness, from homesickness, from the growing uncertainty of life in a new world. Yet their meals were no finer. Even paying passengers on transatlantic crossings brought their own stores: dried beef, cheese, preserved fruit, or bread. Ship captains might supply salted fish or beans, but few offered comfort. Records from the early 1700s show that settlers traveling to Massachusetts or Virginia were advised to bring their own meal kits, including ship's biscuit, smoked meats, dried peas, rice, and cider. These rations were often shared among family units, measured carefully to last the voyage, sometimes 6 to 10 weeks, depending on wind and storm. There was rarely enough. Rats chewed through bags, mold bloomed on cheese, casks of ale soured, water turned green, and yet the biscuit remained unyielding, indestructible, ever dry. It was hated and depended upon in equal measure. One diary from a sailor aboard a colonial sloop reads, "Biscuit again this morning. The weevils we flick out and what is left we eat. Tom said he found one still alive. Better it than none, we reckon." This was the reality. Even food filled with pests was preferable to hunger. Interestingly, it was not uncommon for sailors to refer to the biscuit's tiny invaders as sweetmeat, a bitter joke. Flicking out the bugs became a morning ritual, almost calming in its predictability. And indeed, in some cases, eating them wasn't even avoided. The protein helped. The ship's cook, if there was one, had few tools: an iron kettle, a ladle, a carving knife. Fire was carefully contained, often in a sand-filled box where coals could be banked and fed slowly. Fuel was precious. There was no baking aboard, no open fire. All meals were boiled, stewed, or cold. Breakfast was made the night before or simply rationed from stores. And yet this monotonous food kept people alive. Voyages were long. Scurvy lurked in every corner. Salt rations overwhelmed the kidneys. Water, unless fresh caught from rain, was stale. And the ship's biscuit, dry, solid, blank, was somehow the least offensive part of it all. Still, the routine of breakfast helped structure the day. In the Royal Navy, morning rations were distributed with military precision. Bells rang, watches changed, and each man received his due. In the Merchant Marine, the system was looser, but still centered around the early meal before sails were trimmed, before ropes were hauled, before the decks were swabbed. The biscuit was the first bite of labor. For enslaved people transported across the Atlantic aboard slave ships bound for Caribbean and American markets, the morning meal was far worse. Often force-fed thin gruel, sometimes called Negro porridge, with no utensil, no seat, no dignity. It was a brutal echo of breakfast nutrition reduced to control. Many refused to eat. Some were punished for it. The biscuit, in those cases, became a tool of subjugation, not survival. This, too, is part of the biscuit's story. It was not just food. It was a symbol of endurance, but also of hierarchy. It fed both the desperate and the cruel. You hold one in your hand now, perhaps dry, dusty, tough. You imagine the sea air in your nose, the damp beneath your feet, the endless rocking of the world beneath you. You take a bite and it crumbles slowly. It does not taste of anything. But it kept them going. And so we wonder, how many dreams of the new world began with nothing more than a biscuit and a cup of salt water? The second week at sea. The novelty of the voyage has worn away, replaced by fatigue, dampness, and a deep ache in the bones that no sleep seems to mend. The ship moves endlessly, rocking like a cradle that never soothes. There is no land in sight. There hasn't been for days, only the same monotone churn of gray-blue water and the wind that seems to carry no message. And in the hold, in the corners of satchels and barrels, the biscuits are beginning to rot. Not in the usual sense. They do not mold easily, their dryness protects them, but they decay in a slower, quieter way through infestation, weevils, mealworms, the tiny, persistent signs of life inside what was meant to be lifeless. Every morning before eating, passengers and sailors knock their biscuits on the edge of a bowl. The goal is to dislodge whatever crawls inside. It's a practiced gesture now, almost unconscious. 1, 2, 3 knocks. A pause. Then the scrape of a knife to flick away the powder and the remains. Then chewing, slow, methodical, resigned. No one complains. There is no other bread. Sometimes the biscuit is crumbled into hot broth when hot broth is available. This might be made from boiled salt pork or fish bones, or on rare days, dried onion or turnip if the cook has traded wisely. The broth is cloudy and strong, but it softens the biscuit and eases the teeth. Children, if aboard, are often given the inside of the biscuit, the center where it is least hard, soaked in sweetened water or milk, if such luxuries exist. Otherwise, they chew until tired, then nap curled on bundles of sailcloth. In the journals of 18th century midshipmen, we find endless references to biscuit and beer, the unchanging breakfast that greeted each morning. Even in the journals of future founding fathers, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, all who made sea crossings at one point or another, there are mentions of the biscuit. Adams, in particular, grumbled frequently about the quality of shipboard meals. In one letter home during a diplomatic voyage, he wrote, "The bread is of such firmness it might be used to plug a musket, yet I eat it gratefully, for there is nothing else." But the biscuit was not just for passengers and gentlemen. Sailors, the laboring hands of the voyage, had no better fare. Their meals were rationed carefully, 1 pound of biscuit per day, along with a half pint of peas, a quarter pound of salt pork or beef, and if they were lucky, a pint of small beer. The beer was not strong, it could not be, or the men would be drunk before noon. It was weak, slightly sour, but safer than the ship's water, which often stagnated in barrels after weeks of rolling heat and salt air. The beer washed down the biscuit, which clung stubbornly to the teeth and throat. Meals were eaten with wooden spoons or by hand. Plates were rare. Most ate from communal bowls or from their laps. There were no napkins, no tables. The galley, if the ship had one, was often nothing more than a fireproof box in the stern, where meals were boiled in great iron pots over flickering flames. On rough seas, the fires were banked and no hot food was served. Cold biscuit and salt pork had to do. One notable exception aboard larger vessels was the lobscouse, a stew of salt meat, biscuit crumbs, onions, and any other scraps available. It was thick, oily, and hearty, prized not for flavor but for its ability to stretch rations and warm the belly. When lobscouse was served, it was considered a good day. But the biscuit persisted always. In many ways, it was a marvel of engineering food as infrastructure. Baked in massive batches in Navy dockyards and government kitchens, stamped with marks to identify origin and year, packed into iron-bound barrels and loaded onto ships by the ton. A biscuit from the British Admiralty was baked months before it was eaten, sometimes years. They were so well preserved that biscuits from the Napoleonic Wars have been found intact in museums. Some are edible still, though no one wants to try. And yet, despite its unchanging nature, the biscuit was not immune to symbolism. When food supplies ran low, biscuits became smaller. Men noticed. Rumors spread. Mutiny simmered. The size of a biscuit could signal a shift in power, in confidence, in command. On slave ships, when biscuit rations were withheld or spoiled, it became part of the broader weaponization of hunger. In prisons aboard ships, denied biscuit meant denied humanity. In contrast, when a captain wanted to reward good behavior or restore morale, he might order a fresh batch baked on a stopover port, even with added butter or honey. These soft biscuits, while rare, were unforgettable. Sailors wrote of them with longing. One called it the first bread I could bite without fear. Still, for most, breakfast remained unchanged. A biscuit, a tin mug, cold wind, the unsteady creak of ropes. One man's day might begin like another's ended with biscuit crumbs in his beard and salt on his tongue. For women aboard ship's colonists, wives of merchants, even indentured servants, the biscuit was part of daily life as well, but often shared, reserved, or bartered. A mother might ration her portion to feed a child. A midwife traveling to the colonies might save hers for her patients. Some women brought their own provisions: dried apples, small pots of jam, spice cakes wrapped in cloth, but those were gone quickly. And so the biscuit remained. You hold one again in your hand, in imagination, of course. It is dense, dusty. It smells faintly of flour and nothing else. You knock it once on the table, nothing crawls out. Lucky. You imagine the vastness of the sea around you, an ocean with no beginning or end. You picture a ship cutting through water under a gray sky, dozens of people wrapped in wool and canvas, all chewing the same food, tasting the same dryness, dreaming the same dream. That someday this will be over. But what did they eat their first morning on land, when at last the sea was behind them? There is a moment, small, quiet, and easy to miss, when the sea no longer surrounds you. After weeks at sea, the passengers first notice it, not with their eyes but with their feet. The pitch of the ship has changed. The waves no longer roll beneath them in slow, constant motion. The floor feels for the first time almost still. The smell, too, is different. Less brine, more earth. Distant pine, smoke, the promise of soil. The cry of "land ho" may have rung out the evening before, but now, in the sharp light of morning, the coast is real. They see it from the rail, a low green line pocked with brown, trees huddled together like whispers. The shore is rocky, unfamiliar, but it is land, land after endless water. For many on board, it is the first time they have seen a new world with their own eyes. And now comes the matter of breakfast. It is still the same biscuit, dry, cracked, chipped, but it is eaten differently. There is something in the air, a lifting of spirits. The journey is ending. The next bite might be the last one taken at sea. In the final hours before landfall, the biscuit becomes a kind of farewell, a shared memory in tangible form. Passengers eat slowly. Sailors chew thoughtfully. Even those who once cursed its hardness now see it with a kind of reluctant fondness. It has fed them through storms. It has stayed dry when all else spoiled. It is, in its own way, the last companion of the voyage. Some save a piece. It is true. Diaries and ship logs mention passengers, especially children, keeping part of their last biscuit as a memento, wrapped in cloth, stored in trunks, even buried in the walls of new homes, as if the biscuit could serve as a bridge between worlds, proof of endurance, of crossing, of survival. Once ashore, the contrasts are immediate. A simple bowl of porridge prepared in a colonial kitchen and served with warm milk or honey feels luxurious. Even coarse cornbread seems soft, almost sweet. Apples, onions, cabbage, foods never missed before now seem like miracles. Fresh water shocks the senses. On some ships, captains arranged a final meal on land, a gesture of goodwill or repayment. These meals were rarely grand, but they were hot. Johnny cakes, stewed beans, brown bread, apple compote. Foods meant to ground the body. The biscuit might still appear, but now as part of panade, a soft bread soup with broth and herbs, meant to comfort a sea-worn stomach. But even in the colonies, the biscuit did not entirely disappear. It followed those who had crossed. Families who had once eaten hardtack every morning often kept the habit, especially in inland areas where flour was scarce. Recipes adapted. Biscuits were sometimes grated and fried with fat or baked again with molasses. Biscuit pudding, soaked, sweetened, and flavored with nutmeg or dried fruit, became a way to use what was left, to turn hardship into something more palatable. On frontier farms and in military camps, the biscuit remained a trusted food. Soldiers of the Continental Army ate it with salt pork and cold beans. Explorers carried it westward. Even in homes, some mothers baked journey biscuits for children traveling to nearby towns, using old-style recipes for durability over taste. And yet, for those who had crossed the Atlantic, the memory of that hard breakfast never quite faded. In letters sent home to England or the Netherlands, new colonists sometimes described their meals in striking detail. One man in 1699 wrote, "This morning I ate of corn cakes and fresh milk, soft bread with honey. I wept to chew without pain." Another, a woman who had survived a brutal storm crossing with her infant son, wrote, "I had not eaten a warm thing for 3 weeks. Today I tasted cider and porridge. I do believe my boy smiled." It is easy to romanticize the arrival, the first meal, the first landfall, the first fire not built aboard a swaying deck. But the truth was more complex. Many arrived sick, malnourished, grieving. The biscuit had kept them alive, yes, but it was a meager survival. The New World promised something more: abundance, variety, perhaps even taste. And yet, for all its dullness, the ship's biscuit had shaped them. It had taught patience, endurance, the hard edge of necessity. Those who had eaten it day after day, week after week, would forever remember the sound of teeth against stone, the smell of stale flour in the morning air, and the rhythm of waves against the hull as they chewed in silence. You sit with them now, in memory. You hold a warm corn cake in your hand, golden, soft, and sweet with molasses. But you remember the biscuit. You remember knocking it on the table, the small cloud of dust, the sharp crack of its edge, and you remember what it meant. It meant movement. It meant hope. It meant tomorrow was one day closer. So the biscuit fades but never fully disappears. It is buried in the foundation of colonial kitchens, in the recipes passed down by grandmothers, in the army rations packed with trembling hands, in the sea chests stored in dusty attics. It belongs to no single country, only to the ocean, and to those who dared to cross it. Because in the end, it wasn't just a food. It was a proof of passage. Story 4. Ash Cakes and Fire. Coals. The frontier settlers' dawn. The frontier does not wait for sunrise. It begins in darkness, not the comfortable dark of a shuttered room, but the vast, feral dark of wilderness, a dark with weight to it. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an owl calls. A branch cracks under the footfall of an animal you hope is deer, and not something hungrier. Inside a crude cabin, hardly more than 4 walls and a roof of split logs and clay, someone is already awake. A woman, her name could be Ruth or Charity or Mary, though no record will ever say for sure, kneels beside a hearth that has not gone cold since it was built. There is no luxury of matches. The fire must be maintained, banked with ash each night and revived with care. This morning the coals are still warm. She scrapes them gently aside, revealing the glowing embers beneath. It is time to begin breakfast. There is no pantry in this cabin. No cupboard, no shelf full of ingredients. Only a bag of cornmeal, a gourd of water, and a pinch of salt in a cloth sack. The meal was ground by hand or at a water mill days away. The water fetched from a nearby stream, half frozen and tinged with mud. The salt, a precious thing, was traded for in town weeks ago, or evaporated in a pan from brine spring water, if such luck exists nearby. She pours water into the meal, mixing with her fingers. The dough is thick, sticky, and rough. She kneads it against a flat stone that will double as a baking surface. If she has a cast iron pan, she may use it. But if not, and most settlers in the early frontier did not, she does what women have done for centuries. Forms the dough into a cake, wraps it in leaves, or places it directly on a bed of hot ash beside the coals. These are ash cakes, or journey cakes or hoe cakes depending on region and dialect. But the idea is the same: a bread made with nothing more than what you can carry and what you can scavenge. No leavening, no fat, just heat, grain, and time. The cake begins to cook. The edges firm, the fire flickers. Outside, the land is still sleeping. Or perhaps not, for on the frontier, even sleep must be negotiated. The wilderness does not care that you are tired or hungry or alone. For settlers who moved westward into the dense forests of Kentucky, Ohio, and the western reaches of Pennsylvania and Virginia, the margin of error was thin. A bad frost, a wolf at the door, a wound gone uncleaned, any one of these could turn the season deadly. And so breakfast mattered. It wasn't just a meal, it was energy, fuel, a way to carry a person through labor that stretched from before dawn to after dusk. Felling trees, digging stumps, building fences, feeding livestock, carrying water, making soap, mending harnesses, raising cabins, hunting, trapping, defending. A cake of cornmeal baked in ash may seem unremarkable, but in this world it is sacred. By now the cabin stirs. A child wakes, rubbing their eyes, already chilled by the air that leaks through every seam. There is no insulation here, only chinking made of clay and moss, stuffed between logs to slow the wind. The child does not ask for food. They simply sit by the fire, waiting, understanding instinctively that nothing comes quickly. If the family has meat, a strip of smoked venison or salted pork, it will be sliced and cooked slowly beside the ash cake. A few beans, softened in water overnight, may be added to a pot and placed over the flame. A foraged apple, dried since fall, may be chopped and mixed into the dough for a faint sweetness. There are no spices, no sugar, no coffee. But the cake will be ready soon. The outside will be crisp, the inside soft and slightly gritty. The taste is simple, earthy, with a hint of smoke. The ash leaves its mark, both literal and figurative. Ash cakes are scraped clean, broken apart, shared without ceremony. A bowl of beans, a sliver of pork fat, a sip of water or cider, this is breakfast. It is not eaten at a table because there is no table, just a bench, a hearthstone, a lap, and the still growing light of a winter dawn filtering through oiled paper windows. You can hear the quiet, no street sounds, no bell towers, just the low murmur of the fire and the breath of those around it. This is not the breakfast of taverns or towns. It is the breakfast of isolation, of families who have left behind the relative comfort of established colonies to seek land of their own, often promised by governments eager to push westward, regardless of who already lived there. Settlers built homes in places still claimed and occupied by native peoples, often with tension, sometimes with violence. This cabin stands on such contested land, though the family may or may not understand that fully. The woman by the hearth does not think of policy. She thinks of wood to be chopped, water to be hauled, clothes to be patched. Her hands are raw from cold. Her apron is soot-streaked. The ash cake is ready. She breaks it with her hands. No plates, no forks, just warmth shared. The child eats slowly, savoring every bite. Outside, the day begins. A rooster crows. A door creaks open. Frost crunches under boots. A rifle is lifted from its hooks. A bucket is lowered into a well. This breakfast will last them into the afternoon. Perhaps all day, perhaps longer. It may seem meager, but in this world, even a crust baked in ash is a sign that you've endured another night. And so you wonder, how many days began with ash on the fingers and ended with nothing but the memory of the fire? The wind rises as morning stretches on. It comes not with a howl, but a long, low push through the gaps in the cabin wall, a reminder that the outside world is still present just beyond the log walls, just past the door without a lock. The air smells faintly of frost and distant pine. Inside, the fire continues its steady rhythm. Someone stirs the coals with the iron poker. A soft crackle replies. The ash cakes are gone now, eaten hours ago. But the warmth of breakfast lingers in the cabin, not in food, but in the rhythm it has set for the day. The woman of the house, perhaps Mary, perhaps Ruth, begins preparing the next round of food. There is no pause in this life. Ash cake was only the beginning. Soon beans must be simmered. A rabbit, snared the day before, must be cleaned and stewed. If she is lucky, there may be greens in the cellar, dried dandelion, sorrel, or dock. Not enough for a salad, that concept doesn't yet exist, but enough to flavor broth. She fetches the salt barrel, an object of quiet reverence in the frontier household. Inside, coarse-grained salt glitters like gray sugar. It is not taken for granted. Salt was not easily had west of the mountains in the 1700s. It had to be traded for, mined, or boiled down from brine springs, a tedious, smoky, days-long affair. Every pinch used for seasoning or preserving was measured against survival. She sprinkles some into the bean pot. The beans have already been soaking for a day in creek water. They are not quick to soften, not in this cold. The pot is suspended over the hearth on a swinging iron arm called a crane, if such a luxury exists in this home. If not, it is balanced with stones, rigged with ingenuity. The frontier kitchen is not standardized. It is a world of adaptation. Outside, the man of the house returns from the morning's work. His hands are red and dry. He carries a small bundle of wood and news. A bear has been seen 2 miles north. The river is high. Another family passed through looking for land, asking questions. News travels differently out here, not in broadsheets or letters, but in footsteps and warnings passed by word of mouth. The kitchen is the place where this news is received, digested, and folded into the day. He doesn't ask for food. He warms his hands by the fire. He smells the beans, says nothing. Breakfast in its humble form was enough, not just as sustenance, but as ritual. The act of eating an ash cake in the quiet of dawn creates rhythm in a life otherwise ruled by chaos. It is repetition, stability, a daily marker that says, you are still here. The children, if there are any, are outside now, helping with chores, gathering kindling, feeding chickens, breaking ice in the water trough. Their morning cake is long gone, but they do not complain. Hunger is not measured by desire here. It is measured by emptiness. And until the stomach begins to hurt, there is always something more urgent than food. For lunch, there may be mush leftover cornmeal porridge fried in fat and scraped from the pan, or perhaps griddle cakes if flour is available. Wheat flour is rare in this part of the world and prized when it appears. It travels poorly and spoils easily. Most settlers rely on corn, durable, adaptable, indigenous. It grows in poor soil, requires little tending, and can be stored through winter. The knowledge of how to grow, dry, and grind corn did not come from Europe. It was borrowed, taught often by native peoples who had cultivated it for centuries. That debt is rarely acknowledged, even as it shapes every meal. The woman adds a few drops of sorghum to the beans, a sweet syrup made from cane grass grown in small garden plots. Maple syrup is used farther north, but here, in the Midland frontier, Sorghum is the sweetener of the poor. Thick, mineral-heavy, bittersweet. It turns a pot of plain beans into something nourishing, and a meal like this may be remembered for days, especially if hardship follows. You might think of ash cakes as primitive, but they are ingenious. They require no equipment, no leavening, no oil, just a hot surface and patience. Even the ashes serve a function. Their alkaline quality neutralizes certain bitter flavors, aids in preservation, and gives a distinct flavor that reminds you where the food came from: the fire. When food must be cooked without tools, you become creative. A flat stone heated by the hearth becomes a skillet. A split log, smoothed by hand, serves as a rolling surface. Dough is mixed in a gourd, on a board, even directly on a piece of clean bark. Breakfast becomes a form of craftsmanship. Each element has to be coaxed into usefulness. The settlers' reliance on ash cakes, beans, and foraged greens says much about their world. They had no time for elaborate meals, no interest in gastronomy. They needed calories, fiber, salt, warmth, and above all, predictability. It's important to remember, this life was not romantic. It was not an escape from modernity. It was a slow, grinding trade: comfort traded for land, safety traded for independence. These people did not seek hardship. They accepted it as part of the deal. And yet hardship created moments of rare, sharp sweetness. Once in a while, perhaps on a Sunday or after a successful hunt, breakfast might include apple butter slow-cooked in a black pot for hours with nothing more than apples, cider, and a pinch of spice if available. This would be spread thinly on an ash cake and eaten slowly, luxuriously, not because it was rich, but because it was rare. These are the moments remembered later when settlers looked back from their porches decades later and told their grandchildren about the first winter, about the cold that split the trees, about the time we had to eat whatever we could find. And in those stories, the ash cake always appears. You can see it now, forming again at the edge of the fire. Another batch, coarse meal and water pressed into a round set in the coals. No fuss, no garnish, just smoke, heat, and the quiet determination to keep going. The wind presses harder against the walls, rattling the wooden shutters, but inside the fire holds steady. And so you ask, how much of our history was built not on feast, but on the quiet persistence of a cake baked in ash? Evening. The sky above the frontier cabin fades from steel blue to black. There are no street lamps here, no flickering windows from neighboring houses, just the faint shimmer of stars and the silhouette of pines stretching up like dark spires against the sky. The only light comes from the fire still burning in the center of the home, still watched, still fed. Inside, the hearth is more than warmth. It is life. Around it, the family regathers after the day's labor. The cabin smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and the soft sweetness of scorched cornmeal. A final ash cake is pressed into the coals, not out of hunger, but out of routine. Tomorrow's work waits on the other side of the night. The body must be readied. The cake is thinner now, the bag of meal near empty. Soon, they will make the long journey to the nearest mill or settlement to trade for more. If the road is passable, if the weather allows, if the rifle powder holds, if the body is well enough. Every decision on the frontier has an asterisk beside it, an unwritten clause of risk. Still, the ash cake cooks. The husband repairs a trap. The wife sews a patch onto a shirt. A child whittles a piece of wood into something unrecognizable. Everyone is still but not idle. There is no such thing as idleness here. Time is as scarce as sugar. And yet, there is a peace to this moment, the kind that comes only after total exertion. The kind that follows a day with no wasted effort. The kind that settles into the bones like heat from a fire. The woman breaks the ash cake into thirds and passes it out. The crust is crisp, browned where it touched the coals. The inside is soft, almost steamy, though it contains no yeast, no dairy, no fat. Still, it gives the impression of richness, perhaps because it is warm and the night is cold. They eat in silence. This is not ceremony, it is survival. Across the colonies, from the high forests of Vermont to the muddy rivers of Carolina, thousands of families are eating the same way. Quiet, steady, unsweetened, with smoke in their clothes and grit between their teeth. They are not drawn together by proximity, but by repetition. A shared ritual of labor and meal. A culture defined not by what they could buy, but by what they could make. The ash cake, in its plainness, became the symbol of a people who endured. It required no kitchen, no currency, no supervision. It was the meal of soldiers in the Revolution, wrapped in leaves and baked in campfires. It fed enslaved people escaping north, hidden in embers as they moved through forests at night. It sustained pioneers, abolitionists, homesteaders, and draft dodgers. Wherever an oven could not be built, the ash cake took its place. It was bread reduced, reimagined, refined by fire. Even the name changed over time. In the South, hoe cakes cooked on the flat of a field tool. In the North, journey cakes named for the road. In the West, griddle cakes, corn pones, or simply bread. The recipe stayed nearly the same: cornmeal, water, salt, optional lard if blessed, a single bowl, a hand, a fire. For historians, the ash cake is a curiosity, a relic. But for those who lived by it, it was never quaint. It was sustenance, baked in soot and shared by hands too tired to care about elegance. And in that simplicity lies the truth of the frontier. It was never about flourishes. It was about finishing the day still breathing. In some records, you'll find references to burnt bread or dirty cake, noted with disdain by travelers or town dwellers who passed through remote settlements. To them, it seemed primitive, but to the settler family it was respectable, even comforting, something that could be counted on when everything else, whether animals, neighbors, land agents, could not. You sit with them now, metaphorically. The bench beneath you is rough, the walls are drafty, the air is a mix of bitter cold and radiant warmth. You hold the last piece of ash cake between your fingers. It is dry, it crumbles slightly. There is a taste of smoke, of earth, of something older than wheat. You chew slowly. You understand. This meal, forgotten by cookbooks and uncelebrated by paintings, built the morning of a nation. It did not decorate the table. It sustained it. And the people who ate it day after day, in the dark, in the cold, were not heroes or villains. They were survivors. Their stories were rarely written, their names mostly lost. But their labor, their hunger, their quiet determination shaped the course of everything that followed. Not with speeches, not with flags. With ash, with coals, with cake. So the question remains: if we had to begin again with no tools, no market, no comfort, would we remember how to make bread from embers? Story 5. Coffee without coffee, colonial substitutes and the trade boycotts. You wake up one morning in 1774, somewhere in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The air is sharp, the kind that burns your nose slightly with each breath. Firewood has burned low overnight, and the hearth is only now beginning to recover. The smell in the kitchen is familiar: toasted bread, perhaps corn cakes, maybe fried salt pork. But something is missing. There is no coffee. And that absence on this particular morning is not an accident. Coffee, for a time, was a growing indulgence in the American colonies, though not as ubiquitous as in later centuries. By the mid-1700s, it was increasingly common in homes, taverns, and boarding houses, particularly in port cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston. Imported from the West Indies, or sometimes from Europe through England, coffee came in sacks and barrels, dark and fragrant. It was brewed strong, often boiled directly in pots and strained poorly. Grounds floated on the surface. The taste was often harsh. But it was hot, it was bitter, and it woke you up. To own coffee was a mark of participation in global trade. To drink it was to partake, however quietly, in the mercantile networks that linked sugar plantations, slave ships, colonial ports, and European markets. But for many colonists, especially in the lead-up to the American Revolution, This trade was no longer simply economic, it was political. After the passage of the Tea Act in 1773 and following the infamous Boston Tea Party, boycotts of British goods began to ripple through the colonies. These were not casual protests. They were organized. They were calculated, and they reached into the heart of the colonial kitchen. While the most famous target was tea, the fashionable drink of the wealthy, and the proper coffee came under scrutiny too. Though not taxed in the same way, it was still imported, still connected to empire, still a symbol of participation in a system many now rejected. And so began the strange and bitter age of coffee substitutes. If you were a colonial woman, the one most likely to prepare the morning drink, you faced a question that was equal parts practical and patriotic. What will I serve now that coffee is off the table? The answers were not always pleasant, but they were resourceful. Brewed protest, the early substitutes. Across kitchens and taverns, people began experimenting with locally available ingredients that could be roasted, ground, and steeped into something approximating coffee. One of the most common replacements was chicory root. The root of the wild chicory plant with its pale purple flower and deep taproot could be dug up, cleaned, roasted until dark, and ground into a powder. Steeped in boiling water, it produced a beverage that was bitter, earthy, and deeply satisfying in its own peculiar way. It didn't taste exactly like coffee, but it scratched the same itch. Chicory had long been used in Europe as a poor man's brew, especially in France, and the Netherlands and colonists adapted the practice quickly. It was free, local, and perhaps most importantly, untaxed. Others turned to roasted barley or rye. These grains, when scorched in a dry pan and crushed, released dark oils and a faintly nutty aroma. The resulting brew was thin but warming. With a bit of molasses or milk, it passed as a morning drink, if only barely. Some used acorns, carefully shelled, dried, and roasted. The bitterness of the acorn, usually unpalatable, softened with heat. The resulting brew was strong in flavor, thick in body, and rich in tannins. It was astringent, certainly, but energizing and, again, free from trade. Then there was the dandelion root, long prized in folk medicine. Harvested in fall or early spring, cleaned, dried, and ground, it yielded a drink both herbal and smoky. Colonists prized it not only for its taste but for its supposed health benefits. Good for the liver, good for digestion, good for a conscience burdened by empire. Some mixtures were proprietary, passed from family to family. Others were bartered, shared, or advertised in local broadsheets. In Boston, one tavern offered Patriot's Brew, a roasted chicory and molasses blend said to taste sweeter than tea and loyal to none but liberty. The domestic front, women and the morning cup. While the acts of rebellion were often recorded in pamphlets and minutes, it was women who carried out the most sustained and personal acts of resistance. The boycott of British goods, including imported teas, spices, and coffee, fell squarely on their shoulders. The Daughters of Liberty, a loosely connected network of colonial women, took on the role of organizing, maintaining, and promoting domestic substitutions. They gathered to spin homespun fabric, preserve local produce, and yes, roast grains for coffee alternatives. Their goal was clear: to make the household independent. In the early light of dawn, when families stirred from bed and looked to the kitchen hearth, it was often the woman of the house who answered the silent question: will we stand with the crown or with the colonies? She did not need a podium. She needed a pan, a scoop of grain, and a fire. Letters from this period show how seriously these decisions were taken. One Rhode Island woman wrote to her sister in 1774, "We do not take the tea, nor do we grind the coffee. Instead, we roast our rye until the smoke turns black and drink it with good cheer. My husband says it wakes him as well as any bean." Another wrote more bitterly, "The barley burns before it brews. It tastes of ash and field. Still, I will not drink the king's coffee." These substitutes were not acts of culinary innovation. They were acts of identity. Each sip became a small refusal, each swallow a quiet declaration. The tavern table and public mourning. Beyond the home, taverns had to adjust. These were not just places for drink and gossip, but vital public institutions, especially in towns where newspapers, postal riders, and travelers brought news from distant colonies. Tavern keepers began serving what became known colloquially as Liberty coffee, usually made from scorched rye, molasses, and occasionally carob or roasted peas. Served in tin mugs, it was described as syrupy and thin, but warming to the bones. In cities, patrons debated whether giving up real coffee was necessary or merely symbolic. Some merchants quietly imported beans through Dutch or French intermediaries, bypassing British ports. Others refused to drink any brew at all. In Charleston, one man was refused service for asking for true coffee. The barkeep reportedly told him, "This house does not pour the king's roast. You may try the roots of freedom instead." You can almost picture it now. A tin mug, warm black liquid, steam curling into the air of a frost-edged room. The taste is strange, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Your mouth expects bitterness, body, boldness. Instead, it finds earth, root, and the faint memory of toast. It's not coffee, but it is something. And more importantly, it is yours. The world is changing, ships are blockaded, laws are tightening, armies are forming. But in this moment, before the meetings, before the protests, before the midnight riders, there is a cup in your hand, hot from the fire, filled with something brewed in defiance. And you wonder, when the war is over, will we still drink liberty for breakfast? It is spring, 1775. The air is warming, but slowly. In New England, the trees are just beginning to leaf out, and the roads are still thick with mud. At the edge of a town, green perhaps in Concord, perhaps in Lexington, a woman crouches beside her hearth, stirring a pan of barley in a low fire. The grains are nearly blackened, and the air smells faintly of burnt toast and smoke. She is making coffee, or something like it. Across the colonies, in homes and taverns, in kitchens grand and humble, the same thing is happening. Chicory is dug, rye is scorched, dandelion roots are roasted until brittle, acorns are cracked, their bitterness leached, and their hearts ground into powder. The old coffee, the imported bean, the colonial indulgence is gone. In its place, invention and purpose. From cup to cause, the patriot kitchen. By now, boycotts have become a part of life. The colonies are straining under the weight of laws and taxes, the coercive acts, the quartering act, the prohibitory act. News spreads not only through speeches and pamphlets, but through dinner tables and breakfast fires. The colonies are not just building an army, they are building an alternative life. The rejection of British goods goes beyond fabric and tea. It reaches into the morning rituals that once felt neutral. Coffee, once a luxury for some and a daily staple for others, has now become a symbol, one that must be remade. And so, the domestic sphere, long considered apolitical, becomes a place of radical transformation. Women write letters sharing recipes for substitutes. Rural broadsides list brewing techniques and boiling times. Households begin roasting Liberty blends of roots, seeds, and grains. Some even blend in bits of roasted corn or dried apple peel for flavor. The drinks are inconsistent, thin one day, thick the next, but they are made with pride. In Philadelphia, a newspaper advertises, "Drink of ye earth, not of the crown. Our chicory is fresh roasted and kind to your purse." In Connecticut, the local meeting house serves roasted barley steeped in molasses after sermons. In the Carolinas, taverns offer a smoky rye brew seasoned with blackstrap syrup, bitter but warming. Each cup becomes a conversation, each swallow a decision. A drink of many names. The names for these substitutes are as varied as the colonies themselves. You might find Freedom Coffee, Patriots Roast, Makfi, brew of independence, campfire draft. Some names are jokes, some are serious, but all serve the same function, a way to turn deprivation into declaration. At the heart of this movement is a paradox. These drinks are not necessarily delicious. Many colonists describe them as tolerable, unusual, or best when heavily sweetened. Yet they persisted, because the taste mattered less than the meaning. To drink the substitute was to stand with the cause. And for women who could not vote, or join militias, or sign petitions, this cup was a kind of ballot. Soldiers' brew and the campfire cup. As tensions turned to war and colonial militias mustered, the question of coffee reached the battlefield. Soldiers needed energy. They needed warmth. But supply lines were thin. Ships were blockaded. Beans were scarce. In camps, roots and grains were roasted in pans and stirred into kettles over open fires. Recipes varied wildly, depending on location and what could be foraged nearby. One account from a Continental Army camp in 1776 reads, "We drank a decoction of burnt meal and sorrel root. It was bracing if not pleasant." Another soldier reported making a brew from crushed corn and hickory bark. "The taste," he wrote, "put steel in the blood and acid in the tongue." The military necessity of the morning cup could not be ignored even if it was only symbolic. Officers knew morale lived in small rituals. Even a poor substitute for coffee offered a sense of order, a rhythm to the day. Some regiments began receiving shipments of coffee again by 1777, rooted through French allies. But by then, the habit of the alternative was ingrained. For many, it was a mark of loyalty to endure it. To say, "We do not need what we do not control." Quiet endurance at the hearth. In the countryside, as the war wore on, substitutes became part of family tradition. Children who had never tasted real coffee grew up on barley brew and molasses water. The drink was no longer merely a stopgap, it had become a part of the culture of resistance. One woman in New Jersey, writing in her diary in 1778, noted, "I found the chicory root yields more depth if dried in the sun before the fire. My youngest says he prefers it to the bean. I smile, for he has never tasted the real." There is pride in her tone, not bitterness. The war has brought hunger, uncertainty, fear, but also innovation and ownership, a sense that the daily meal no longer belongs to empire but to the household, to the people, and perhaps to the land. Because these substitutes, chicory, dandelion, rye, corn, are not imported, they are gathered or grown. They come from the very soil the colonists now claim as their own. To drink them is to consume the nation they are trying to build. You sit now with your tin mug again, this time in the glow of a new fire. Inside it, a drink made from roasted rye and a pinch of molasses. It is smoky, harsh, slightly sweet, not coffee but something that demands your attention, something that, despite itself, wakes you up. The war outside rages on, but here in the kitchen, in the camp, in the tavern, the revolution continues in quieter ways. In every sip that says, "We can make our own way." And you wonder, when peace comes, will we go back to the bean or stay with the root that got us through? The war has ended. The Treaty of Paris is signed. The colonies are no longer colonies. A new nation, uncertain, ragged, bold, begins to take shape. But before ballots are cast and constitutions debated, before borders are drawn or taxes imposed, something else begins to change. The coffee returns. Ships arrive in port again, bearing barrels of green beans from the Caribbean, from Brazil, from far-off Java. Merchants, once cautious, are eager to resume old routes. Grocers reopen shop. Imports resume. The markets stir. Newspapers announce, fresh coffee arrived, West India quality for sale by the pound or barrel. And in kitchens and taverns, the people pause. Some rush to purchase, to brew what they've long remembered, to return to the taste that defined mornings before revolution, but others hesitate, not because they dislike coffee, but because it no longer means what it once did. For nearly a decade, the people had lived without it. They had made do, created new habits, found new rituals. Chicory root had become more than a placeholder. Roasted barley had grown familiar. Molasses mixed with grain felt like home. The substitute became the standard. And for some, it became a symbol not of loss, but of pride. Memory in the mug. In a farmhouse kitchen outside Albany, an old woman lifts a wooden scoop of dried dandelion root from a jar. She has brewed this drink every morning since the first boycott. Her husband died during the war. Her sons are now farmers. Her grandchildren don't know what imported coffee tastes like. She pours the water, the roots steep. She drinks in silence. This is not defiance. Not anymore. It is habit, memory, a quiet continuity. She doesn't drink it to protest the crown. She drinks it because it reminds her of who she became when the world changed, when she rose early, foraged in the fields, roasted what she could, and brewed a future from bitter leaves. In another home, this time in Boston, a widow, who once hosted Daughters of Liberty meetings, serves her guest a blend of chicory and rye. She apologizes for its thinness. Her guest smiles. "I remember this from the war," they say, "still warms the hands." Persistence of the substitute. Even as imported coffee regained popularity, the colonial substitutes did not disappear. In many rural areas, they remained common through the early 1800s, not out of necessity, but by choice. Chicory especially found lasting favor. Its bitterness mellowed with milk. Its color resembled coffee. It was cheaper and easier to store. By the 1830s, it was a staple in parts of Pennsylvania, New York, and the Ohio Valley. In the South, roasted corn and barley drinks became associated with frugality and tradition. And during future shortages, the War of 1812, the Civil War, even into the Great Depression, Americans would once again reach for the old methods. Roots, grains, leaves, earth in a cup. The cycle repeated. Each time a scarcity, each time a substitute, each time resilience. In this way, the bitter brews of the Revolution laid a foundation for how Americans understood deprivation, not simply as suffering, but as an opportunity for self-definition. To drink something made by your own hand, from your own soil, was not a failure. It was freedom. A different kind of independence. It is tempting to measure revolution by battles and declarations, to mark its progress through blood spilled and flags raised. But in truth, the war for American identity was fought in kitchens and fields, over kettles and hearths. It was fought in the small decisions made daily: what to wear, what to grow, what to eat, and what to drink. The coffee substitute was not about taste, it was about trust. It asked, can we live without what we're told we need? Can we build something with what we already have? The answer again and again was yes. And so, in the quiet years after the war, as the Republic unfolded in fits and starts, some people kept their Liberty brew. Not because they had to, because they chose to. A tin mug, a scorched blend, a habit that remembered what it had taken to endure. You sit now by the hearth once more. The fire is lower than it used to be. The house is warmer. There's glass in the windows now. The war is years behind, but the brew is familiar. You sip. The taste is rough, darker than tea, softer than coffee. There's a rooty sweetness at the end. You think of everything this cup has meant, the hands that prepared it, the days it saw, the cause it carried. You no longer drink it to defy a king. You drink it because it belongs to you. So you ask yourself, was it ever really about coffee at all? Or was it about what we learned to make when the empire stopped feeding us? Story 6. The Molasses Morning: Caribbean Influences in American Colonies. You awaken to a thick, sticky air. The morning is warm unnaturally so for spring and carries the scent of damp wood, burnt sugar, and distant salt. You are in Boston, perhaps, or Newport, or Charleston, but the scent in the air is not local. It traveled. From the Caribbean, from the cane fields, from barrels marked with ship names and plantation brands. This morning your breakfast porridge is drizzled with molasses, a dark, slow-moving syrup so black it almost gleams blue. It clings to the spoon, sweet and slightly bitter. You eat it slowly. You know where it came from, and though the table is quiet, the air is heavy with something unsaid. Because in the 18th century, the American colonies did not produce molasses. They bought it, and with each purchase, they bought into something far greater than a flavor. Molasses in the colonial kitchen. By the 1700s, molasses had become a staple of the American colonial pantry. Cheap, shelf-stable, and calorically dense, it was used as a sweetener in everything from bread and porridge to baked beans and small beer. Unlike expensive, refined sugar, molasses was accessible to the working class and essential to poor households. It was mixed into gruel to soften its blandness. It was boiled into syrups and candies. It was fermented to make rum. It flavored everything from sausages to vinegar pies. And it came, overwhelmingly, from the British West Indies, particularly from sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. These islands, though small, were economic giants. Their cane fields were worked by enslaved laborers under brutal, deadly conditions. The molasses that reached American tables was not simply a byproduct, it was part of a system. To sweeten your breakfast was to taste the product of slavery. The triangle trade. It's often taught in shorthand. Molasses to rum, rum to slaves, slaves to molasses. But the truth was more complex and more pervasive. The triangular trade was not just a neat circuit. It was a tangled web of ships, merchants, and plantations. Molasses flowed from the Caribbean to the American colonies. It was processed into rum, particularly in New England, where distilleries in Rhode Island and Massachusetts produced tens of thousands of gallons a year. That rum was then shipped often to Africa, where it became currency in the trade for enslaved people. Ships carrying rum, guns, textiles, and iron exchanged goods for human lives, then sailed to the West Indies, where those people were sold, and the ships loaded again with sugar, molasses, and coffee for return to America. This cycle built fortunes, it built cities, it built colonies. In Providence, Rhode Island, nearly every street near the docks had a rum still, a molasses warehouse, or a ship outfitter. In Boston, merchants advertised fresh barrels of Sweet Island gold. In Charleston, molasses was auctioned alongside people part of the same system. To eat molasses was not just to eat sugar. It was to consume the scaffolding of empire. The economics of sweetness. Molasses was cheap because people were not. Plantation owners maximized profit by extracting every ounce of sugar from cane, then selling the leftover molasses in bulk to American buyers. Colonists saw this as a bargain. A slave might be worth 40 pounds to 100 pounds, but a barrel of molasses cost only a few shillings. Inexpensive, durable, and profitable when distilled, molasses fueled not just meals but economic mobility. For working-class colonists, molasses offered something rare, a way to flavor life without breaking the purse. It appeared in daily meals spooned over cornmeal mush, used in baking, stirred into stews, or diluted into molasses water for hydration. In poorer households, it was often the only sweetener available. But for merchants and distillers, it was far more than a sweet treat. It was currency. Rum distilled from molasses became a tool of barter. In some coastal regions, especially in Rhode Island, rum became more liquid than coin. And yet, even as molasses sweetened colonial lives, few asked what it cost. Not in shillings. In lives. Voices from the edge. Some did see it. A few Quakers and abolitionists, even in the early 18th century, wrote against the use of slave-produced sugar and molasses. In 1739, a Quaker pamphlet from Philadelphia stated, "The blood of the field clings to the sugar, the cry of the slave sticks to the cask." Others remained silent. Molasses was too essential, too widespread, too ordinary. One Massachusetts housewife, writing in her diary in 1764, noted, "We have not meat enough for the week, but the children are soothed with the black syrup on their bread. It is a comfort I cannot withhold." She never mentions where it came from, or how. You finish your bowl. The spoon rests heavy. The sweetness lingers, but now it tastes different. You think not just of breakfast, but of barrels and fields and ships rocking in foreign harbors, of heat and lash, of hunger and trade, of what it meant to taste the Caribbean in an American kitchen. And you wonder, is sweetness ever truly simple, or is it always bought with something bitter? It is midday in Boston, 1770. The sun reflects off the harbor, gilding the barrels stacked along the dockside. You pass them one by one, rough oak, iron-banded, sweating slightly in the spring warmth. They smell faintly of smoke, brine, and something sweeter, molasses. Dozens of them. Hundreds in some ports. Each one holding the thick black syrup that would feed households, fuel distilleries, and grease the wheels of trade. You might not know where these barrels began, but the men who load and unload them, the coopers, the dockhands, the bookkeepers, do. They whisper names: Antigua, Jamaica, Barbados. They speak of ships like floating kitchens, air thick with fermenting sugar and rot. They know the cost even if they rarely say it. You stop by a tavern near the water. A young man serves you a tankard of rum, flip warm, slightly sour, laced with burnt molasses and a froth of egg. It burns, it soothes, it makes the afternoon pass, and it ties you invisibly to a world of fire, cane, and boiling vats. Because molasses was not just an ingredient, it was an industry. Inside the boiling houses, on a sugar plantation in Jamaica, the air is molten. Cane arrives by the cartload, chopped by enslaved laborers who rise before dawn and work until collapse. The stalks are crushed in wooden rollers, the juice collected, strained, and poured into massive boiling cauldrons. The heat is unbearable. The smell is sweet and cloying. The noise is constant. As the juice boils, it transforms from pale green to gold, then amber, then dark brown. Crystals rise and are skimmed off to become sugar. What's left behind is the skimmings, the waste, the residue. Molasses. This byproduct, this sludge of empire, is scraped into barrels and sold to the colonists, to Americans. A slave who cannot speak his own name may work 12 hours over boiling pans, earning nothing so that a child in Massachusetts may taste something sweet in her porridge. The rum that built New England. Back in the colonies, particularly in New England, the arrival of molasses sets other fires in motion. In Providence, Newport, and Medford, distilleries churn daily. The air smells of yeast, smoke, and scorched sugar. Men unload barrels, dump molasses into vast wooden fermenters, and wait. Days later, the bubbling, foaming mixture is poured into copper stills and fired. The steam rises. The alcohol condenses. Rum. It pours into casks, into bottles, into ships. It becomes currency, medicine, celebration, exploitation. It is drunk in taverns and served to sailors, traded for slaves and furs. Children are given diluted versions to calm them at night. Rum becomes so integral to the economy that some towns collect taxes in gallons, not coins. 1768, account from a Massachusetts distiller notes, "The molasses come in sweet this month, shall make 900 gallons before week's end." Another writes, "The still runs hotter when mixed with rye, but the island syrup alone yields the smoothest liquor." This is not incidental. This is structure. Taxes and tensions, The Molasses Act. In 1733, Parliament passed the Molasses Act, designed to regulate trade between the American colonies and non-British Caribbean islands, particularly the lucrative French West Indies. It imposed a steep duty, 6 pence per gallon, on foreign molasses. The goal: protect British planters. The result: widespread smuggling. Colonial merchants forged documents, bribed customs agents, unloaded barrels at night. The law was almost universally ignored. Even honest traders saw it as absurd, a threat not just to profit, but to survival. In some ports, molasses accounted for over half of commercial imports. In Boston, one merchant wrote, "We cannot brew, we cannot trade, we cannot live without it." By the 1760s, tensions worsened. Parliament replaced the Molasses Act with the Sugar Act of 1764, cutting the duty in half but enforcing it strictly. This time, they meant to collect, and the colonists pushed back. To them, it was more than a tariff, it was control. Molasses, once just a flavor, became political. Back in the kitchen. You return now to colonial home, small and smoky. A mother pours hot water into a mug with a spoonful of molasses. She stirs it slowly, watching the syrup dissolve into a thin, brown broth, sweet and slightly metallic. This is molasses water, a common drink in homes too poor for tea or cider. She hands it to her son. There is no talk of Jamaica, of tariffs, of trade, only this small moment of comfort, but the drink carries all of it: the fields, the boiling houses, the ships, the laws. She dips a spoon into a pot of beans simmering on the hearth. She adds a ladle of molasses for flavor, for sustenance. Baked beans, now iconic to New England, were once a molasses dish. The sweetness balanced the salt pork. It thickened the stew. She breaks cornbread with a crust of burnt syrup. She pours a little over porridge. She keeps a small crock of it wrapped in cloth, away from heat and ants. Molasses is not a treat. It is a thread woven through every meal. You hold a spoon again. The syrup moves slowly. In it you see reflections of docks and boiling vats, of laws and ladles, of labor unseen. You smell smoke and heat and salt. You taste the cost not just in coin but in lives, and you begin to wonder. What happens when sweetness becomes so familiar, we no longer question where it comes from? Evening falls on a coastal village in New England. Not far from the docks, a single lantern flickers in the window of a kitchen. Inside, a pot of baked beans simmers slowly over the fire. The scent is unmistakable, savory, sweet, and slightly smoky. It clings to the rafters. It is Saturday. In Puritan tradition, Saturday was bean baking day. The Sabbath followed. To avoid cooking on Sunday, women prepared hearty pots of beans with salt pork and a generous spoon of molasses. They would simmer overnight in brick ovens or by the hearth, ready for the Lord's Day. The sweetness was not extravagance, it was preservation. This is the legacy of molasses: subtle, slow, and embedded in the rhythm of daily life. No longer only a product of trade, it has become ritual. But behind every stir of the ladle lies a past the spoon does not forget. A nation sweetened on sorrows. By the end of the 18th century, the American colonies had become the United States. The war had been won, independence secured, but the economy and its relationship with molasses remained tangled. Despite their new sovereignty, American merchants continued to rely heavily on Caribbean sugar and molasses. Trade resumed. Rum still flowed. The triangular trade reshaped itself, but its bones remained. And slavery, the dark current beneath the sweetness, continued. Even in northern ports like Boston and Newport, the molasses business had deep ties to slave economies. Merchants who never owned a plantation profited from its products. Distilleries that never saw a cane field relied on its harvest. Colonial wealth, even revolutionary spirit, had been, in part, fermented in that sticky barrel. In 1790, Over a third of American exports were related to rum, sugar, or molasses. Sweetness was an export strategy. Bitterness was someone else's burden. The Boston Molasses Flood 1919, a thick reminder. More than a century later, in January 1919, Boston would be reminded again of molasses' strange power. In the North End, a massive storage tank holding over 2 million gallons of molasses collapsed. A wave of syrup, 25 feet high, rushed through the streets at 35 miles per hour. It demolished buildings, overturned freight cars, and killed 21 people. The scene was surreal: horse-drawn wagons frozen in a sea of sugar, boots stuck in the congealed flood, rescue workers wading knee-deep in syrup. Locals swore they could smell molasses on warm days for decades. Though the flood had no ties to Caribbean plantations or slavery, it echoed the story of molasses, underestimated, far-reaching, and ultimately deadly when left unchecked. In the quiet of the morning, you return now to the breakfast table. A slice of cornmeal pudding, a spoonful of sweetened beans, a mug of warm water with molasses stirred gently in. You sit in the home of a free woman, perhaps 1830s Massachusetts, perhaps 1850s Pennsylvania, who chooses not to use cane sugar. She's heard the stories, read the pamphlets. She buys maple syrup instead, or sorghum when she can afford it. Her children ask why. She tells them about fields they'll never see and people they'll never meet, and the meaning of choosing what goes into a pot. Her molasses crock sits unopened. It is not that she cannot afford it. It is that she remembers. Legacy in the kitchen. By the turn of the 20th century, molasses had been largely replaced by refined white sugar. The old syrups were seen as rustic, even backward. But in rural homes, on farms, and among the poor, molasses remained. It flavored choufle pie in Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens. It sweetened Johnny cakes along the southern coast. It remained a staple in Boston brown bread, baked in tin cans and steamed for hours. And it lingered in folklore, a substance of comfort, of memory, of resilience. The taste had changed, the trade had changed. But the question remained. What does it mean when your breakfast carries the weight of another's labor? Modern reflections, the ethics of sweetness. Today, molasses sits quietly on supermarket shelves, mostly forgotten, rarely questioned. It's bought for gingerbread cookies, baked beans, or barbecue sauce. Its past is rarely read from the label. But it is still there. Its slow pour, its deep color, its bittersweet taste, all reminders of a time when flavor was political, and every spoon carried a story. To study molasses is not simply to study food. It is to study power, trade, silence, complicity, adaptation. It is to realize that even the most ordinary parts of breakfast, a syrup, a loaf, a pie, are shaped by the systems that fed them. You hold the spoon again. Let the syrup drip slowly into the bowl. Let it pool. Let it remind you of barrels in the sun, of boiling houses in far-off lands, of rooms filled with warmth and shadow. Because this morning, your meal remembers. And maybe so do you. So then you ask, when we taste sweetness today, how much of history are we still swallowing?